Hello, welcome to The Poet and the Poem. I'm Bruce Rice, Saskatchewan Poet Laureate, and I have with me Chelsea Coupal, whose new book, Sedley, has been out recently, and it's been nominated for 3 Saskatchewan Book Awards, which is not bad for a first book, I would say, Chelsea. And the purpose of The Poet and the Poem is to give poets a chance to talk about their work, and particularly poems that are significant to them in their book or in their writing career. And so I'd like to talk with Chelsea about Sedley, which is her book, published by Coteau Books. And now I have a question for you, Chelsea.
Mm-hmm.
The last I saw this book, it looked like this. But recently I was in the Coteau Books office and I saw a book called Sedley that looks like this. What is going on?
Yes. Indigo, so the company that owns Indigo, Chapters, and Coles, took an interest in the book, basically, and they decided to have Coteau create their own Indigo exclusive version, so they put the new cover on it, and they purchased a number of copies, and it's available in Chapters, Coles, and Indigo stores across Canada.
Well, that's fantastic. And it's great to see poetry getting out there into the world, because we need more places that will put poetry books on their shelves and promote them. And I understand you were saying that they actually have a person who's responsible for poetry
Yeah, I believe they have a poetry buyer, and that he sort of created this Indigo exclusive version as part of a fall poetry promotion that they did just this past fall. So.
Right.
So yeah, it had really great placement. It was on tables and sort of on really visible shelves at the front of the stores. So it was a really great opportunity for me and the book.
Yeah. So full disclosure, I was editing this book, but unfortunately I don't get to bathe in the light reflected glory.
Sure you can.
Why not? Well, here we are. But I just wanted to ask you a few questions about your background and how you came to poetry. But the book is called Sedley, which is?
My hometown.
Okay, and where is that?
It is southeast of Regina, about a half hour's drive southeast of Regina. So a small village of about 300 people.
Wow. And but you went to university here. How did you get from Sedley to Regina? And I understood you took an MA in creative writing at University of Regina.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So right after high school, I moved to Regina to attend university. And I actually started out in pre-journalism and completed a journalism degree. But then I went back to school afterwards to complete my Bachelor of Arts honors degree in English. And then a couple of years later, went back to do my Master of Arts degree in creative writing. So it wasn't really until university that I really started getting interested in poetry. I took a few creative writing classes. When I did my honors project, I focused on Sedley with that project. Mm-hmm. So a few of those poems from quite a long time ago did end up making their way into this collection. Mm-hmm. And then I sort of just really expanded on that for my master's thesis.
Yeah. And I saw that seems like you've had some really good instructors while you were at the university there, and some of our best poets in the province, actually.
Yes, I've been very, very fortunate. My first English class in university was with Jerry Hill, and he encouraged my writing very much early on. Mm-hmm. And so I took several classes from him, several creative writing classes, and I would say that was probably my very first experience attempting to write poetry. And then from there, I took some creative writing classes from Medri Purdom, and from Randy Lundy,
who we just interviewed last week.
Yes, yep. So, yes, I've been very lucky.
Yeah, that's great. So, when you first started to write this book, were you conscious that you were going to be writing a book about Sedley, or did it just grow? What was the process for developing the book?
Well, I guess when I first started writing poetry, you're writing a lot of poems that are almost sort of assigned to you, right?
Yeah.
And then it was in one of my creative writing classes where I believe we were assigned to come up with a bit of an idea for a portfolio. And when left to my own devices, I found myself just writing these poems about where I grew up. So it sort of just seemed like the natural thing to expand on.
That's true. Although, and the interesting thing is that your poems don't just focus exclusively on your life; they're about a whole community, which is often sometimes you don't see that in a first collection. It'll be often confessional poetry or another type of poetry that has to do with things as a younger writer that the person is working through.
Yeah, I really like that observation because I do see the speaker in many ways as more of an observer of what's going on in the community than maybe deeply exploring aspects of her own life, right? She's observing incidents that take place, whether they be, tragic incidents or incidents that somehow have a big impact on her, or she's just sort of almost doing character studies, I think, of some of the people that she's encountering as she grows up.
Right. And as you began writing the book, did anything change in your writing? Were you surprised by anything as you got further into the manuscript? Or in retrospect, is there anything about the writing of it that surprised you that you didn't expect?
Maybe, to be honest, while I was a university student, one of my professors was very interested in form poetry, and I found myself drawn to that challenge, and I really ended up liking it as well. I liked the challenge of creating something that was fresh, but also having to sort of follow a set of guidelines. In some ways, it forces you to be more creative because you're trying to create something to take a certain form. And I think that surprised me. I'd say at the beginning, I don't think I ever expected there to be sort of a number of form poems show up in the collection.
Yeah, I think I noticed at least 4 when I was looking at it. There's a Pantoum, a Sestina. There's some other forms in there as well, I think. And it's really interesting because when you see writing about the prairie, it's often a narrative, straight up narrative form, or it may be a lyric form, but often not using those kind of looking at those kinds of forms that you're working with.
Yeah, and sometimes it's neat, too, to think about how the form lends itself to the subject matter, right? Like, I think sometimes with agriculture, right, like things are really cyclical, and oftentimes form poetry introduces repetition, and so I liked playing around with that as well.
Right. And so one of the things that we've done in this series is asked poets about what poem in a book means the most to them, or they feel is a key poem in the book, or perhaps it's affected their practice or their writing themselves in some way. And the poem you chose is called "We Knew," and maybe I could ask you let's have you read that poem.
Sure. We knew. Not to fear the night that held us to itself, hummed us to sleep with the crickets. We knew David's dad drank too much. Not in a mean way, just in a soft, lost way. Every night alone in the cold concrete of his detached garage, clinging to a bottle of draft in one hand, cigarette in the other, to cast himself out of there. We knew when we saw storm clouds, swirl of sky over canola, we were really seeing something. We knew in the end we'd forgive ourselves for the torture. Times we told the whole school, Angie got her period in class, Jay put cover-up on his acne, I looked like a rodent, all cheeks and teeth. We knew about winter, that if you tried to walk home full of rye and lay down, hush of snow sending sleep, under a sparkling ceiling of 2 trillion stars, you wouldn't get frostbite, you'd die. We knew Brandon's brother went organic, not because he cared about being green, eating clean or anything. He couldn't pay his chemical bill anymore, couldn't pull in big yields, couldn't keep up. We knew prairie could pin you down to the ground like a graveyard cross, so some of us couldn't leave, even if we wanted to. Knew sometimes we loved being 13 kids, living 13 years together, that knowing left unsaid. We began to see that death walks steadily forward, doesn't rush or get tired, just walks endlessly, calmly. And when it eventually heads right toward you, most are too scared to look.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for that reading. And I have to say, as I've been rereading the poems, it's great to see how the poems leap away from the traditional way of thinking about a place. And in this case, I was really impressed by, you were talking about the different characters you've written about. And one of the things that really, there's two things that stand out. One is, this is not exactly prairie Gothic in tone, which I think we've seen before, but it is a kind of very factual, understated listing of all the issues and pressures going on in these towns, in these places below the surface. And I almost feel like this is, we've had a history of prairie writing about, and prairie poetry about these places, but there's a generational change, and this is more like a modern take on contemporary take on what's going on in these towns. Is that did you feel like you were trying to write in a new way when you were doing this, or was it, this is just me?
No, not really. I just feel like maybe as a young person that it maybe feels more contemporary. But I know what you're saying, that I think a lot of the prairie literature that we're familiar with, there's sort of an abundance of literature about like the dirty 30s or maybe the 50s, and that I really tried to come at it from, I want this to have a contemporary feel and, be something that feels like it could have happened in the last 10 years.
Right. And a lot of writers even now who are writing about the prairie have left, they're living in cities and they've been here for some time. So it's a very different perspective, because you get a very clear picture of the town in this writing. And that's it's a really interesting take on what's happening in the world. And there's different things I loved in terms of the character, and you were talking about the characters. But one thing I noticed is you don't physically describe people very much. It's we know them through their actions and the way the community reacts. So we see the character. So, for example, that line about, we knew David's dad drank too much, not in a mean way, just in a soft, lost way. Two lines just really speak volumes. And I think that what it reminds me of is travel poetry, because people will go to a country, and of course they're describing the country and stuff like that, but the writers who live there, that's already in their story. So what they seem to do is proceed with whatever the story is, and somehow the landscape around them fills it in. And so when you've described this character in this way, you haven't bothered with he was wearing this farmer hat or whatever the cliche might be. It goes right to what does a person do, and then somehow it gets past this initial layer, I find. And it's sort of like an intimate knowledge of the characters in the town. There's quite a few characters in here.
There are.
And so have you told them that you're actually taking notes?
No, but they know now.
Yeah. And what sort of response have you had from the people that are aware of the book?
It's been really positive, to be honest. I had friends from Sedley come to the book launch, and many of them have purchased the book and read it and sent me really positive comments. Because, to be honest, that was one aspect that I was perhaps a little bit anxious about before the book came out, is that I was writing from my hometown. I was taking inspiration from some of those characters or experiences. So I did wonder about the reception a little bit before the book came out, but it's all been really positive. Yeah. The local paper has covered the book and that kind of thing, so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Do you think in some ways that as a poet you're actually saying things that they either haven't had the words to say or had the permission to say?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
The other thing too is, I mean, at the end of the day, it is fictional, right? So I've taken inspiration from that place and those people. I've also invented quite a bit in the collection as well. So I think looking at it through that lens, maybe it's difficult to become upset or angry with anything that's in the collection.
And when you get down to the end of this poem, one of the things I see is that you almost dare to declare yourself as a poet when you say, "We began to see that death walks steadily forward, doesn't rush or get tired, just walks endlessly, calmly." And on its own, it's such an effective, an affecting thing to say. But also, the interesting thing is you're talking about young kids getting a sense of their own mortality. And I feel, and there are young characters in this book, and I feel like you're giving them credit that they don't get sometimes about, having some sense at least of these things.
Yeah, I like that, because I think, like you said, maybe we often think of teenagers as behaving really recklessly with absolutely no idea about what the consequences might be. But I did want to try to express, well, no, there are things we knew about, right? And maybe the adults in our lives didn't realize we were aware of certain things, but we definitely were. And maybe related to that too is just the fact, I think, that sometimes living in a rural community or dealing with agriculture, death might seem a bit closer, perhaps, than it does in other settings. So, friends of mine whose families raised animals, right? You're dealing with cattle who get sick, or other farm animals that get sick, or pets that die in traffic accidents, or even in this collection there are a few instances of community members who are killed in sometimes tragic ways, and it feels really close to home when it's in a community that's of such a small size.
Yeah, and there's some quite moving poems about those incidents, but it's the interesting thing to me is that there's different numbers. There's about 3 or 4 of them that I can remember, and often you'll see a poem about a single incident, but the fact is that this does surround you. And even if I know when my own kids got a little bit older, and there's a certain age at which things start to happen to their friends. People are in an accident, or sometimes suicide sometimes, and sometimes just bad things happening, and suddenly that childhood ends, really. And then, of course, it's not just the young people. There's one about a husband, I think, who's the school teacher who died, a school teacher in a traffic collision. And there's, so it's not just the young people, but also the ripples through the families, and it's a different perspective once you put it all together. Like, this is part of this, the undercurrents in this whole community. And I wanted to ask you, what for you makes a good poem? What among the poems that have really stayed with you, or perhaps inspired you, or just simply moved you? What goes into a good poem as far as you're concerned?
That's a loaded question in a way. I think I'm often struck by really strong imagery, and I think that's something that I try to bring out in my own poems. And I think I try to also explore all the senses, right? Like, it's, how do we experience a place? It's not just what we see, it's what we smell, what we hear. I'm a sucker for a good metaphor. So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you're mentioning the senses, because there are a lot of ways you describe the prairie in ways that other people wouldn't see, and it's a way of experiencing the physicality of the place that can only come with having been there for so long. And I think one of them is the anticipation of fall and the smell, the changing smell as fall approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one. I think you're thinking of one right at the beginning of the collection.
Yeah. And there's other things too. There's a poem about jogging along the road, and I've seen people. You're out on this rural road, and jogging is just something that doesn't happen in the cities. But it's really interesting to see somebody jogging along and taking in the rhythm of the road. And that was one of those. I believe that was the Pantoum, if I'm not mistaken. And that's a poem where the line repeats. The lines are repeated, and then you wind up in your final verse. Very interesting form, which I realize as I was reading captures the rhythm of the running very well. So it's a really interesting poem from that perspective. And I'd say kind of risky. Did you feel it was a bit of a risk opening your book with, I think you've got a couple of those forum poems in there?
No, actually, because I sort of like that poem because I feel like it really sort of sets a scene, right? And it's kind of on the fringes of the community. It's not right in there. So in a way, I think I imagine it as sort of like a movie as you're starting to kind of zoom in on the setting, but that's kind of a nice maybe introduction to the community. You're kind of just right on the edge.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you to read another poem, and this is one that you said you read a lot and you're very personally like, and it's called In the Morning. And if you wouldn't mind reading that for us as well.
Sure. In the morning. We live in lines now. On pages, snow falls slow and steady as sleep, softly as crane feathers. Softly as crane feathers, snow falls slow. From a midnight ink sky, I could dip the tip of my pen in, write whichever ending I choose from the last 2 years. The one where I drag my pen over the coral heart curve of your lips. We used to kiss with open eyes. Yours were a cold shade of pasture in morning mist. A cold shade in mist. I learned this is how you write a poem. Run your tongue over it 10,000 times. Relentless. An open wound. Chipped tooth. Something almost senseless.
So, combination of love and what a poem is. And it looks like pain, a lot of pain, the open wound. But actually, when you compare that with, say a prairie landscape poem or some of the poems, there's a documentary element in your work here because it's writing what you know about the history and the place. But this is a kind of a departure, and the sound. I love how the sound works in this poem. It's very, it's like a little sort of an inhalation when you're reading the book. It's really a great poem to come across. And so do you read a lot of the more lyric poetry, the more singing type of poetry as well, or?
Well, I can talk a bit about some of the poets that I've come across and that I love. I love Sherry Benning's work. I consider her to be a big inspiration. I read her collections as I was working on Sedley. Another collection that I think about a lot is it's called The Lease by Matthew Henderson, and he wrote a collection about his time working on the oil fields in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Karen Solly, Lorna Crozier, so
a lot of those poets. And there's a lovely, we're talking about the things that you see from being there, and you've got some things in this poem, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but what I love is the particularity of how different poets approach their writing and how it reflects their actual experience, and then it gets transformed into poetry, like that shade of pasture and morning mist. And there's, I think and there's a little bit of that form, that you use in here, where you're reversing, winding up and unwinding. It's a great kind of feeling to the poem.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about form too, is you realize you can borrow elements from the form poetry, but you don't necessarily have to follow all the rules, right? You can kind of make up your own rules and repeat where you might want to.
Just to show what that form looks like, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind reading as well A Plain Run, which was a little bit of a pun there, I suppose, but this is a pantoum, I believe, and let's...
A plain run. I run at dusk over gravel and stones, glance at red waves that rip through the sky. Under my feet a crunch like bones, everywhere wind, a songbird, a sigh. Glance at red waves that rip through the sky, wash over flax fields, lavender sand. Here is wind, a songbird, a sigh, as day's breath sips cold at my hand. Red waves wash over flax fields, lavender sand. A doe in the ditch stands bone still and stares, as the day's breath sips cold at my hand, and the foals in the pasture nudge at the mares. A doe in the ditch stands bone still and stares. My lungs, breathless shells, tap at my chest, while the foals in the pasture nudge at the mares. They graze on the grass, feast without rest. My lungs, breathless shells, tap at my chest. Under my feet, a crunch like bones. The mares graze on grass, feast without rest. I run at dusk over gravel and stones.
Yeah. So start and end with the same line. And thanks for that. That's I love the way the rhymes work in this poem, and it's something we've forgotten. I remember being asked at a class at 8:30 in the morning, 40 below, to read to a class, and the teacher asked me about rhyming poetry, and I'm quite sure the person wanted me to affirm that rhyming poetry was wonderful and all that, but the fact is, whether it's rhyming or not, all poetry written, it's just a small percentage that really works in the way that this one does, or poetry does generally. But it's again, it's not the kind of poem that you usually see associated with, prairie poetry, prairie environment. And there's something about the familiarity of everything is here. I wanted to ask you, how do you think of your writing practice? Do you is it something you see as you do on yourself, or is there a community part, or and there's a writing community to work with? How do you see your practice?
Well, when I was in university, I felt like I had a built-in community because I was taking so many creative writing classes, right? So I knew I had to bring work forward and workshop periodically. That being said, since I've left university, I've written mostly on my own, but to be honest, didn't feel like I was being as productive as I could be or should be. So recently I did join a writing group to just give myself a bit of that structure that I had and actually liked in university, sort of, knowing that other people are expecting you to submit work, and I've found that to be helpful.
Yeah. So the small writing groups really work, and I know there's a myth that when you have a writing group, everybody winds up sounding the same, but in my experience, nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, the members in our group have really diverse interests. I would, there's a fiction writer, there's another poet, but her poetry is very, very different. She's not writing anything resembling prairie poetry. So,
yeah. And so, where do you see your writing go from this point?
That's a good question, and something I think I've been contemplating myself, to be honest. Do I continue to write from this very prairie perspective, or do I take it somewhere else? I think I'm still figuring that out.
Okay, and one last question I have for you. I guess you would be considered an emerging writer, which to me is kind of funny because usually it takes 10 years to emerge, which what's an elephant take to give birth? It's a few years. But anyway, is there anything that you've learned as an emerging writer, that advice that you would give to other writers that are becoming serious and really finding their way toward that first book or after the first book?
Keep reading. Keep writing. I mean, I think sometimes the best teachers are the books that we love and find ourselves coming back to. And keep writing. I think sometimes maybe we feel that, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm concerned that, you're going to write something and it's not going to be any good, but I think it's getting past that and realizing, like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, you have so much time to sort of toss things away and revise, that the important thing is just making sure you make time and make it a priority and sit down and do some writing. Mm-hmm. And, some of it will be bad, but some of it hopefully will be good and worth reading and sharing.
Well, thanks very much, Chelsea. And where we go from here, a couple of these poems that you've heard will be posted on the Poet Laureate webpage. It's Musings, Poet Laureate Musings is what it's been called. And there'll be links to the poems, and I believe we'll have some audio recordings of just the poems if you if you'd like to hear the writer's voice. So thank you, and please join us again for the poet and the poem.